Hi, everybody. Welcome to tonight's Artist Talk with Stephanie H. Shih. I'm Kate Holohan, Curator of Education and Academic Outreach here at the Syracuse University Art Museum. Tonight's event will consist of a conversation between Stephanie and the museum's curator, Melissa Yuen. There will be an opportunity for attendees to ask questions at the conclusion of their conversation. And of course, you know, we are 2.5 years or so into Zooming, and I'm sure most of us are very well versed in Zoom etiquette. But a brief review. Our talk is set up as a meeting tonight, so please just make sure your audio is muted. We can also mute you if you have any issues there. A live transcript is available, and you can click on the live transcript button icon at the bottom of your screen if you would like to use the live transcript option. And please use the chat option at the bottom of the screen to ask questions or share comments. And like I said, we'll have time at the end for Melissa and Stephanie to respond to those. If you are having technical problems with your Zoom, please message me in the chat and I will do my best, or my colleague Emily, we will do our best to assist you. We are recording this program and we will share it more widely afterwards. So if you know of anybody who might be interested but isn't here tonight, you can contact us and we'd be happy to share it. Before going further, we, as an institution, want to acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, fire keepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous peoples on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands. And now I am going to turn things over to Melissa Yuen, curator of the SU Art Museum. Welcome, Melissa.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you all for joining us this evening. I am delighted to introduce the Syracuse University Art Museum's Art Wall project and our 2022-23 artist, Stephanie H. Shih. In its second year, the Art Wall project is dedicated to site-specific works commissioned annually from emerging contemporary artists. Located at the museum's entrance, the project thus activates this highly visible space and provides an opportunity to use the artworks on view to foster interdisciplinary conversations. To this end, for the 2022-23 iteration, the museum worked with Stephanie Shih to realize the exhibition currently on view. So without further ado, Stephanie Shih is a Brooklyn-based artist who explores the material relics of migration and colonialism through the lens of the Asian American diaspora. Her painted ceramic sculptures examine the relationship between cultural interchange, consumerism, and identity in immigrant communities. She has had solo exhibitions in New York, Los Angeles, and Miami, and also here at the SU Art Museum. Her work has been reviewed by the LA Times, Hyperallergic, Cultured, and NPR, and received support from the American Museum of Ceramic Arts Lighthouse Works, where she is currently located, and Sober Arts Project. Activism is central to Shih's practice, and since 2017, she's raised over $100,000 for marginalized communities experiencing instability related to home through her art and platform. So welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Melissa.
So before we begin, why don't we introduce the Art Wall project, and let me share my screen and we can get started from there. So Shih's exhibition for the Art Wall project is titled My Sweetie Has No Pockmarks, and I show here an installation image. And it features 4 hand-sculpted ceramic bags of rice and a ceramic tatung rice cooker, which you see here on the screen. And since we have this image here, why don't we begin with this installation? So Stephanie, what drew you to rice as the subject matter for this exhibition?
Well, rice is such a ubiquitous staple food in East Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia. And I think oftentimes in the West, it gets flattened, or, you know, there are actually many types, many different cultivars of rice, and they're used in many different ways in different cuisines. And I just thought it was a nice kind of metaphor for the way that Asian identities are sometimes seen in the West.
Yeah, and I mean, when you think about how kind of media representations of kind of Asian identity, it's often been kind of flattened into this kind of monolithic experience where Asian Americans were, according to some media representations, seem to have like the same experience. And I love how, by including these different kind of varieties and really brands of rice, that you are really kind of starting to tease out kind of how Asian American identity has been constructed, and then to really allow for this opening and expansion of the conversation.
Yeah, and a lot of activist and political conversations I've had with other Asian Americans, one of the common questions right now is there such thing as Asian American solidarity? Like, does our racial identity actually bind us together? Obviously, in one way it does, because we are often viewed as one homogenous group by non-Asian viewers, but also there are so many other identities which may be more effective for political organizing, like class or immigrant status. Like a question we ask ourselves a lot is like, what does a Burmese refugee in the United States have in common with an upwardly mobile second generation Asian American who, is in STEM and makes a large salary and lives in Manhattan, right? Like, is their Asian identity actually what's connecting them?
Yeah, and I think those conversations are really important to have. And I think as we talk through some of these images, I hope to be able to return to the two examples that you've given and to really kind of tease out some of these complexities as well. So why don't we turn to a view of two of the works on view. I show here the rice cooker at left and the extra fancy Botan Calrose rice at right. And so the Tatung rice cooker at left, it's a very particular avocado green color, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so Datong or Tatung is a Taiwanese company that I think they originally made electronics, or I'm not quite sure, but they came up with this patented type of steam cooker decades ago, and it became kind of a quintessentially Taiwanese product. And in the 80s, when I was growing up, it was this particular color of tatong, which was this avocado green, that everybody, including my family, had at home. It was discontinued for a long time. I think this color kind of fell out of fashion, but by popular demand, Tatong had to bring it back first in Taiwan, and actually just last month they relaunched it in the US as well. So it has this bit of nostalgia, not just for me, but obviously like there's enough nostalgia from the diaspora that that this colorway has come back.
Yeah, and I want to kind of talk a little bit more about this idea of nostalgia in your work. So the bag of rice that we see at right, the design of it is vintage, because if you go to the grocery store now, the design of it is a little different. So can you talk a little bit about your interest in this intersection between food and the past? Like, why does it hold so much meaning for you?
I just think food is an incredibly intimate thing, right? In all cultures, we have a cuisine, we have food, we have to eat to sustain ourselves. And I think oftentimes for diasporas, as the members of that diaspora get further and further away from the homeland generationally, I think that often it's food that makes them feel most connected to the quote unquote motherland. Because they might not grow up with the traditions or the cultural norms of the motherland, because they may or may not have even spent any time there, but their parents most likely still cook the food from there. So I think it's this way that immigrants and children of immigrants feel really tied to their past and their heritage.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, like with food, it also elicits this like taste memory as well. So it kind of like adds to another kind of sensory element when we really spend time looking at your work in particular. So like I said earlier, Stephanie sculpted 4 bags of rice for this installation, and I show here details of all 4 of them. How did you decide on these 4 brands, and why did you decide to sculpt these 4 brands in particular?
I definitely wanted a variety of cultivars of rice and also countries of origin. So here we have Milagrosa, which is a jasmine rice on the left, and then a sweet rice, which is also known as glutinous rice. And then the last two are japonica, or they're just kind of like medium grain sticky rice that most people are familiar with. It's similar to sushi rice. And then they are from, I believe, Thailand. The next three are actually from the US, but of different heritage origins. So both Japanese and Chinese. And then obviously I wanted them to look good together. So it was both an aesthetic choice and a historical one.
Yeah, and I want to pause for a moment and talk about the three cultivars that are grown in the United States, the glutinous rice and the chew bags at Wright. And I think kind of thinking about the history of how rice has been cultivated, it really does tell a global story. And I'm just really thinking also about agricultural practices. And I think that's like one of the reasons why your work is so interesting. And it really does allow us to have all of these kind of interdisciplinary and really interesting conversations as well.
Yeah, so farming and agriculture was actually one of the first big industries for Chinese immigrants out in California. And so I think all three of these originally come from California, but the Botan, which is Cal Rose, the Cal is Cal as in California. It was a type of Japanese rice that was then cultivated or recultivated or whatever proper agricultural term I'm supposed to be using here. So it's actually a uniquely American strain of rice.
Yeah, and I think that then opens up, additional conversations about like Asian American identity. Like if it's like, if the origins of that cultivar was Japanese and yet it was grown and then it's in a way become Americanized as well. So I think it's also a nice metaphor.
Yeah.
So looking at these sculptures, I am really struck by how tactile they are. Can you talk a little bit about your process as to how you made these works?
Yeah, so people are often surprised to find that all my works are hollow. I built them out of stoneware coils, so just like the coil pots you made in elementary school. I build them coil by coil and I smooth them out. And so that's why you see this texture, which is a bit fingerprinted and bumpy. I like to keep that texture. And obviously with the rice bags in particular, really just, it gives it that feeling that it's a sack that's full of grains.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about the sagginess of them?
Yeah, so I always like to sculpt from real life. So I bought two different types of bags. One, this is the one that's like more sack-like, whereas the other type has gussets on the side, so which helps it stand up a little bit more. And so I was honestly just like picking up the bags of rice and then dropping them until it fell in a way that I liked. And then I would just sculpt from the real life object.
And I see how ingenious you are in this particular image, kind of really kind of using all available limbs and surfaces to create your work. So it looks like you're in your studio in this particular image.
Mm-hmm. So my studio is actually a corner of my apartment in Brooklyn. I keep kind of funny hours. I often work until sunrise. And so I actually found that having my studio in my apartment was just really, I don't know, it just really suited my lifestyle or my schedule. So I'm used to working in actually like a 5 foot by 5 foot corner of my apartment. Right now, like you mentioned before, I'm at Lighthouse Works, which is an artist residency on Fisher's Island. And for the first time, I have like a space which is just my own and just for my art. And it's been really interesting to see how that's affecting my making.
And I know you've only been on Fisher's Island for a short period of time. So can you talk a little bit more about how this like additional space has shaped your practice?
Well, so I already have a set number of pieces that I'm sculpting here. So, I really would love to be here with no agenda. And I think that the ecology of this place would really affect my work if I was able to explore the connection between my work and the island. I would probably be making a lot of fish. But just, I don't know, just having the space is really freeing, even though it's so funny. When I first moved into the space, my instinct was to put all of the furniture I brought and all of the goods like in one corner, like almost recreating what I have at home, just because I was like, I'm just so used to having everything in arm's reach. And I had to think about like, oh, I don't need these things so close to me, and forcing myself to spread out in the room. And now just being like, oh, it's nice to be able to eat lunch not in a pile of clay. Like there's a separate table for doing lunch. And so it's been really fun.
Yeah, so you mentioned that your studio is in your Brooklyn apartment, and with a ceramic studio practice, with having to transport, greenware and bisqueware to the kiln, are there transportation difficulties? Yeah, could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the kiln that I fire in is about a mile away from my house. And so I have a great assistant, Allie Gels, who is an artist in her own right, but she luckily has a car. And so we have to bring all of the greenware down 3 flights of stairs in my apartment building into the car and then drive it over to the kiln. And it's pretty precarious. Anyone who's worked with greenware knows that once it is dry, it is very brittle. And so this is a view of us shepherding them, and there's like lumbar support behind the bags so that they're just well supported, and everything had to be very soft, because if you go over a bump and it hits the wood, you could definitely crack it.
So have there been any casualties from this transportation process?
Just a couple. I would say there have been 2, but I work with a really amazing traditional Japanese kintsugi artist who will sometimes mend it with the gold. And also I recently met a sculpture restorer, Jenna, who is really incredible. She's only worked on one piece of mine, but I didn't know you could do that to ceramic. She uses epoxy and all these different dyes and resins, and she can mimic exactly the way the clay and the glaze look, and it's incredible.
Yeah, so the next image I have in our PowerPoint is additional studio images that you've kindly shared. And I want to talk a little bit about like the character that we see in each of the bags of rice. Can you talk a little bit about like kind of the character that you imbue in your work, and how kind of that has in a way become a signature of the works that you make?
Yeah, so I would say that the rice bags and other bag-like objects have the most character because they have that slump. I think when you have a bottle of soy sauce, I think it would be harder for people to say, oh, this soy sauce really has character. But yeah, the slumping really, I think it really draws people in, I've noticed. I think it just makes something feel that much more lifelike. And then, of course, because everything is hand painted, from far away, it might seem like you're looking at a real grocery, but then up close, it's immediately obvious that everything is hand painted.
Yeah, and so you consider yourself a sculptor and a ceramicist, but so much of your practice is about painting. Can you talk a little bit about this like tension between like working as a sculptor, but really so much of it kind of hinges on painting?
Yeah, I honestly, whenever people ask me, oh, what's your medium? Are you a painter? Are you a sculptor? I always avoid using a word there. And I say, I make painted ceramic sculptures. There's a way in which I don't quite feel like a sculptor, and a way in which I don't quite feel like a painter, even though I have a friend who's always trying to convince me, no, you are both. You are making paintings that just happen to be in the round. But for whatever reason, imposter syndrome or whatever, I didn't have any formal art training. But for whatever reason, I have a hard time calling myself either.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and really thinking about these as three-dimensional paintings or paintings in the round really, in a way, enhances our understanding of your work, because these are, even though in particular these rice bags, the way they're installed at the museum, we're really meant to see them from the front. There are three-dimensional objects, and I wish that given the space, we could like have people walk around them, because I think the objects are so interesting and can really, we can learn so much from looking at them in the round.
Yeah, these bags in particular don't have anything on the back because the vintage rice bags were only printed on one side. But typically, if there are nutrition facts or whatever on a back label, I will always do that. And one of my personal pet peeves actually is there are some contemporary sculptors who make things in the round. They're working in 3 dimensions, but they only paint something on the front of the vessel. And it just makes me think, oh, why are you working in 3 dimensions? But yeah.
Yeah, and talking a little bit more about your process, and I'm glad we have these 3 bags on the screen right now. So thinking about like the materiality of clay and how clay behaves. So once you put clay through the kiln, it shrinks, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so without giving away all of your studio secrets, like how do you account for that? Like, does it involve like crazy proportions and lots of math?
So it's actually nothing special. There's something called a shrink ruler. They often come in a few different proportions. My clay shrinks roughly 12% from being fully wet to being fully vitrified, fired all the way. And so I measure the real object. Let's say that's 18 inches tall. And then I used the shrink ruler to measure 18 inches, which is the 18 inches on the shrink ruler is much bigger because it's counting for a 12% shrinkage. And so the ruler is actually quite accurate. Oftentimes when I put something side by side after it's been fully fired, it will be the exact same proportions as the real object.
I didn't realize that shrink rulers existed. I can just imagine you like erecting all of these like elaborate like pointing systems and
well, so the shrink ruler that I used was actually one a friend designed. But yes, there are definitely, you can buy shrink rulers from any store that you get certain supplies from.
So you talked about measuring the sculptures, and in a previous image, we saw you sculpting from a bag of rice. So what happens to the groceries that you work from? Like in creating the work for this show and in its aftermath, like, do you have like 100 pounds of rice in your apartment right now?
I have a lot of groceries in my apartment. In my bedroom, it never occurred to me that it was strange until people came over and saw them. But like one dresser, the entire top of the dresser is just full of soy sauce bottles. And I didn't think it was weird, but then people would be like, why do you have so much soy sauce in your bedroom? So yes, they do pile up. Obviously some things get used, but I have so much rice at home. I've been trying to give it away. But yeah, it's a funny little collection. Somebody contacted me recently because she's writing a book for Abrams about collections and collecting. And I think she wants to think of collecting not just in the traditional sense of like collecting stamps, but different collections that you might have. And I never thought of this as a collection. And she contacted me and said that she wanted to write about my collection of groceries sculpture references.
And in a way, it's sort of meta too, because you have, your collection of the actual soy sauce bottles or actual groceries, and then you also have your collection of the sculptures as well.
Yeah, it's funny. Because I'm on an island right now, and it's not. They say that it's remote but not isolated, but I actually think it's the opposite. I think it's not that remote. It's only a couple miles off the coast of Connecticut, but it's very isolated. Everything that comes here has to come on a ferry. And so I brought all of my materials here with me. I brought 300 pounds of clay with me. Rather than, if I were doing a residency in a city, I could just go out and buy it, or it would be easier to have it shipped here. So one of the things I brought was a 25-pound bag of rice, but it wasn't for eating, it's for sculpting. they asked me, oh,
Mhm.
should this go to the house or to the studio? And I was like, no, this is for the studio.
That's really funny. Can we talk about the exhibition title that you've given to the installation currently on view at SU? The title you gave is My Sweetie Has No Pockmarks. Can you talk a little bit about the title and its origins?
Yeah, so there is a common, it's funny, there isn't like a specific set of, I was asking a Chinese academic that I know if there was a specific set of words that is used to express this idea. And I guess there's not, but there's just this idea that parents express to their kids at dinner time to encourage them to eat all their rice, that for every grain of rice that you don't finish in your rice bowl, your future spouse will have, that will be another pimple or pockmark on their face. And it's just such a funny, it's such a funny idea. And since this was about rice, I wanted to nod to that. And so my sweetie has no pockmarks.
I find it curious that you describe this saying or this idea as an idea, because for me, like growing up, my mom said that to me, but it was always in the form of like a warning, like you better eat all of your rice. If not,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a warning. I think it never made sense to me. I was just like, I just don't think that that's the way it works.
Well, that actually brings me to my next question, which is like when we were kind of developing this show and you proposed the title, I have to admit that it kind of took me a second to figure out, you know, the translation into English of that very idea. But once I made the connection to, you know, what my mom told me growing up with the title that you proposed, I couldn't stop laughing about it because, you know, it was so familiar, which then in a way like adds another layer of understanding and understanding and really appreciation of your work and really of to this installation. And so my next question has to do with like how your work seems to operate a lot on like two levels. You know, the first being like these sculptures are artworks that appeal to a diverse audience and then can open up larger conversations. But like for Asian Americans in particular, like there is a lot more that meets the eye with your work. And I don't want to say like there is like a secret understanding, but there's like a certain nod to our heritage. So can you speak a little bit more about that and why you like emphasize or really build this dynamic into the work that you create?
So I think that my work is that way because I'm that way, right? I think that the way a lot of people in the Asian American diaspora describe themselves as being split between two worlds, the American world and like our Asian heritage world. I kind of think that that's not really a helpful way to think about it because I'm never just in one world or the other. When I'm in a Taiwanese space, I am still an American, and when I'm in a white space, I still look the way I do, right? And so I really think that you can't separate the two, and that's not. I don't know. I've always just been kind of averse to the idea that you're split, and
Mm-hmm.
so in that sense, I think that my work has these levels because that's just who I am as an artist, and it's not that it's deliberately built in, but that if you're going to be talking about identity, the identity of Asian American diasporic people, that there's always going to be levels there. Um, the movie that just came out that was so popular, Everything Everywhere All at Once, everyone I know loves that movie, Asian or not Asian. But all of my Asian friends think, oh, that's such an Asian American movie. There are so
Mm-hmm.
many things, like there's so much subtext, there's so much in like that can't be translated to the subtitles that you pick up. Um, and they really appreciate that. But it's not as if my non-Asian friends think that they've missed something, right? They still love the movie. In fact, they've been surprised when I've said, oh, there are all these like things that you might not know about. It doesn't make the movie any lesser to them, even though they're not necessarily picking up every cue.
Yeah, I think it's this nuance that really kind of that sets your work apart and really allows for this the conversations that we hope to have with, students here at the SU community and with our larger civic community as well. So yeah, I really appreciate kind of working with you on this project. And so why don't we turn our attention to your career more broadly? So you are known for making ceramics of pantry staples found in the Asian American kitchen. And here is an installation view as well of the show currently on view at the SU Art Museum. And our next slide, there we go, are some examples of your early work. Now, what prompted you to start sculpting these grocery items?
So the picture on the left are like my earliest sculptures. And, I didn't set out with a vision as to what this series would become. I've been working on this series now for 4 years. It just kind of happened. I had been looking for a way to connect my identity and heritage with my art, and I was really struggling to do it in a way that felt resonant to me. The first body of work I made were my contemporary interpretations of dynastic vases and vessels. And so like a bull's head vase or a phoenix tail vase or a Qing dynasty teapot. And I liked the work, and I didn't realize it then, but I didn't really have a connection with it because honestly, a bull's head vase doesn't mean anything to me. I didn't grow up in the Tang dynasty, and I didn't know that this vase was even a thing until I did the research, right? And so one day I noticed that the clay I was working with had this elasticity. And for some reason, I don't even know why, it just occurred to me like, oh, I bet I could fold a dumpling with this. So I folded the dumplings. And then once I started folding the dumplings, then, well, of course, you need the black vinegar to go with it. So yeah, it just kind of happened organically. And at that time, my Instagram was just my personal Instagram. And I just started sharing them, and I was really surprised that people were really responding to it. And there was an increasing amount of attention and press around it. And I realized I had accidentally hit on something that really resonated with people. And so I often think of my work as an open conversation with my viewers. A lot of the things that I have sculpted have been crowdsourced from my followers, because I don't think of my body of work as being about me and my heritage, even though it is personal to me, obviously. But I'm interested in the broader idea of the diasporic experience. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I want to talk about crowdsourcing since you brought it up. So for the SU project, did you crowdsource the rice brand, the brands of rice that you ended up sculpting?
I think I did. I had an idea to do a series of all bulk rice bags for a long time, and I think I had those brands in my mind already. Like, I didn't grow up with jasmine rice. I grew up with short grain Calrose rice, and so a lot of the things that I sculpt, are not from my personal memory.
So when you do this crowdsourcing on Instagram, were there any unexpected results that you encountered? And how does that then kind of shape the project that you're working on?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, there are always surprises. For my last show, the concept was Western goods that have a special place in Asian cuisine. For example, Spam is a really good example that it's a quintessentially American product, but during the Korean War and World War II, and the Vietnam War, I imagine, it made its way into Asia with the U.S. soldiers. And so that's one that we all know, but there were so many other brands that I didn't know had a hold on the Asian community, right? So I didn't know that for Vietnamese people, apparently Heineken and Hennessy are the two drinks that you always have at every Vietnamese gathering.
Oh, I did
those
not
are-
know that either.
and I didn't know that. But I got that response from so many Vietnamese people, and then I would like do a little bit of research, because it's always a little bit of field work, a little bit of research, and then they kind of influence each other. Yeah, so I would say that that's an example of things that are surprising to me. I feel like I'm always learning more. Like research is a really important part of my process.
And I show here an array of the soy sauces that you've sculpted in the past. And this project, and correct me if if I misunderstood, Stephanie, this was also the result of a crowdsourcing project or a crowdsourcing campaign?
Yes, this was sorry, hold on. I opened the chat and now I can't close it. Okay, there we go. Yeah, this was a similar thing where I made 30 soy sauces, all from different countries of origin. This was for a show with Periton in New York City. And so there were like, there is a type of thick sweet soy sauce that is used in, I think, Indonesia and Malaysia and Singapore that is called ketchup manis that I had never heard of. And in fact, I asked somebody, oh, what's Kat Manny? And he was like, are you talking about ketchup manis? Like, I didn't even know how to pronounce it, you know? Yeah, so I've definitely learned a lot from my audience.
Yeah, and before we talk about kind of other aspects of your career, I want to kind of conclude this discussion by talking about like your use of Instagram, because you are very active on it and you use Instagram, I think, in a really interesting and distinctive way. So can you talk a little bit about like your reasons with this kind of heavy engagement with your audience?
I think one reason is just because like I have like millennial posting brain disease, and I am just like attached to my phone. I cannot be more than 5 feet away from it. And also I think most of all, it's because my account was my personal account. I was not attempting to become a career artist. I didn't think that that was realistic for me. I didn't go to art school because my immigrant parents said that that wasn't a pragmatic thing to do, which is probably correct. And so I think when I started posting my art, I was just sharing it with friends. And so it was just like my personality, it was just the way I was using Instagram. I think I was worried as my career started becoming a little bit more serious that galleries and institutions wouldn't like how much I showed. The art world in general is an extremely opaque place, at least, with commercial galleries and all of that. And artists are always fretting about, oh, will the gallery be mad if I do this? And so a lot of artists I know are very careful about what they post online. When I had my first commercial gallery show with Sebastian Gladstone in Los Angeles, I asked him, I said, is it not okay if I post my work in progress? Like, am I supposed to keep it under wraps until it's the time for the big reveal? And he said, whatever you are doing is working, so don't stop. Like, you're engaging people. This is how people are finding out about your work. There's no reason for you to stop. Like, and it just made me realize that it's an opaque industry, and yet there are no hard and fast rules, especially now in the age of like the internet and social media. A lot of traditional rules around how you interact with galleries is changing.
Yeah, and I have to say, like, even though I was introduced to your work by a colleague, like I really followed your career on Instagram, and like with kind of each project that you've worked on, I can see your career kind of shifting in really interesting ways. And we can conclude with that question after one final one, which in your bio, I talked about how you call you're an artist, or you're an artist activist. There we go. I'm trying to like smush the two words together. And during the summer of 2020, you also documented some of your participation in the protests after George Floyd's murder. And you also run like fundraisers on Instagram and contribute designs to support these endeavors. And I show here a screenshot from a Grub Street article highlighting your work in June of 2020. So how Can you talk a little bit about this intersection between your studio practice and your activism? Like, in other words, like, what does it mean to you to be a artist activist?
I think this is very similar to the discussion we were having earlier about, our diasporic people split between two worlds, or do they encompass one world, which has many layers to it? And for me, it's not that I'm an artist and an activist, but that both are part of my life. I was I was interested in movement work, long before I knew I would have an art career. And so I would almost say that that was definitely first in my life. I was kind of radicalized in 2011 by Occupy, and then 2013 Trayvon, Philando Castile in 2017. So I was really interested in the Black Lives Matter movement for many years, and so I think that when I became a more serious artist, it just kind of made sense, like that all the parts of my life would blend together. It wasn't necessarily an active decision that I made. And then once I had this platform that I never intended to get and never expected to get, it felt imperative that I try to use it for this thing that mattered so much to me. And then I think it also is related to like I said about just like my millennial posting habits, right? Because I am out on the street, I want people to know, because I also know that that is how other people get involved. Again, I think that I know a lot of artists who are worried, oh, if I'm too political online, then galleries won't want to work with me. And you know what? That's probably true. There definitely are galleries that don't want to work with more political or outspoken artists. But also there are galleries who want to, who, that is part of your story, and galleries and institutions and collectors, everyone likes to know who you are.
Yeah, and kind of going back to really the role of social media in contemporary society, like that, I think that platform allows us to really explore like all facets of our identity, and to really be able to, in a way, really share that with everyone. And I think that in of itself is a valuable thing. And so,
Yeah.
So to conclude, my very last question for you is, what are you working on right now, and in what direction do you see your future work going?
So right now I am making work for an upcoming solo exhibition I have at Berggruen Gallery in San Francisco, which will be exploring the history of San Francisco Chinatown through objects. So starting with the railroads and the gold rush up through contemporary contemporary Chinatown. And so that's why I'm working here on the island. I think that my work will continue to be about exploring diasporic narratives, sometimes pushing against them, sometimes researching them more, but that I'm open to moving away or expanding out from food. I'm still mostly interested in domestic spaces, but yeah, there are definitely some non-food objects in the upcoming show. And then next fall 2023, I have an exhibition which will be focused on Chinese luxury knockoff culture. So no food.
Well, I'm excited for that show, in addition to the show you're currently working on, because I think, yeah, just thinking about like Chinese luxury knockoff culture, there's like, you can take it in so many different directions.
Yeah.
And I think it's like a very kind of also a very contemporary commentary as well.
Yeah. And I like to, politically, I lean kind of Marxist. I like to think a lot about class and immigrant status. And so I think that there's a lot there in terms of, questions of labor and how Chinese bodies are viewed.
Well, thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you.
Why don't we turn it over to our audience now? Are there any questions for Stephanie from our audience? For those who would like to either drop your questions into chat, or since we're a pretty small group, for those who would like to turn on their cameras and unmute themselves, feel free to directly ask Stephanie your question. Well, I have a question via one of our visitors who came into the museum earlier this semester. And the question was about the surface finishes of your sculptures and how the visitor was really struck by how shiny the rice cooker was compared to the really matte surfaces of the rice bags. Can you talk a little bit about kind of like the finishes of your sculpture and kind of how and what you decide to do for each?
Yeah, so I'm always trying to mimic the original material. So the bags and the sacks of rice are typically either fabric, or historically were fabric or paper. And so for those materials, I always leave it unglazed, which leaves it matte. And anything that's glass or metal or plastic, I'll use a high gloss glaze. And then sometimes I'll try to go somewhere in between.
Thank you. Do we have any further questions? Kate, did any roll in?
Yes, there was one in the chat from about, I don't know, almost a half hour ago. So earlier in the conversation, and Rebecca asked, was it intentional to paint the gallery, the SU gallery wall, the same blue as the walls in your apartment? And so that's directed at you, Stephanie, assuming the colors are the same, very similar, because we saw that photo of your works in progress that looked like it was in perhaps your apartment.
Yeah, it was not intentional. I guess I just really like that blue. I knew that I wanted the gallery to be not white, since the majority of the work was white, the rice bags. I had considered either red, which is obviously a very important color in Chinese culture, but then thought, oh, that's, you never paint a gallery red. It's going to be like, I was just worried it was going to be too intense. And I thought about other colors that appeared on the bags themselves. Like there's this kind of hunter green, which is very popular in the bags. But I realized I wanted a more complementary color, not complementary in like the color theory sense, but I wanted the bags to really stand out against it. And so there's not, only 2 of the bags have a little bit of blue. And then the dark blue was also a nod to blue and white porcelain designs, which is obviously very popular in Chinese like ceramic history. Yeah, so that's why. But yes, it is basically the same color as my kitchen.
It looks like Connor raised their hand. So Connor, if you would like to unmute yourself and ask the question, please go ahead.
Awesome. First, I wanted to say thank you so much for having this and speaking to us. Your work is incredible.
Thank you.
And I did join a little bit late, but I'm not sure if you already explained this, but for the SU exhibit you have, and I guess for other pieces you make, do you usually try to model it after something that's next to it as you're making the ceramic, or do you just do it off of what you're thinking that you've seen in your past?
So whenever possible, I try to work off the real thing. It's just always easier for me. I get very particular about measuring and being very exacting in my sculpting, which is kind of strange because I'm not like half as exacting in my painting, but for some reason that's like really important to me. But it's not always possible for me to sculpt from real life because a lot of times I'm using vintage packaging that no longer exists. Sometimes I get lucky and only the label has changed, but the bottle is the same shape. But sometimes I'm really just working off of photos, or sometimes even like newspaper ads from the 50s, that I've looked up on some kind of newspaper archive. And in that case, I'm literally measuring the pixels and then doing a little bit of algebra, like fractional algebra, to try to figure out, okay, I think that the neck is 1/3 the height of the full bottle, or what have you.
Wow, that's pretty amazing because all of those have so much depth and texture to them. It's really impressive you can do that off of photographs.
Thank you.
As a follow-up question, when you're working on working on kind of vintage products, have you tried to source them from like eBay or anything?
Yes. Once my assistant and I ordered some Ovaltine from eBay, and it came half full with Ovaltine from, I think, the 90s. And I'm like, I bet the Ovaltine is still good. Like, it's just this dehydrated powder. And part of me does want to try it. It's still, it's sitting on my bedroom dresser. Yeah. So yes, we do sometimes order things from eBay if it feels like that one in particular, we couldn't find that many photos of it online. Other times Allie will just like write to the eBay seller and be like, what is the exact diameter of the bottle? And the sellers are always very eager to tell her because they're trying to sell the product. But because some of these things are now collectibles, sometimes these very particular dimensions are actually listed. We have many little like tricks now that we use to try to find that info if it's vintage. Sorry, a pickup truck just drove by. There are very few cars here, but I guess that was one of them.
I love how resourceful you are in your studio practice. So
yeah, I don't know if it's because I'm self-taught or if I would have made art this way regardless. But yeah, there is a lot of internet research.
I have a question. Well, first, there's a YouTube channel where these guys occasionally will buy discontinued foods on eBay and then actually try them. So that does exist on the internet. But I had a question that came up. I was in the galleries yesterday with a class, and one of the SU students asked about how much your ceramic rice bag sculptures weigh. And it sort of kicked off this discussion about, that's missing from our experience of objects when we're in a museum. We can't touch. Of course, we don't include that information in labels. And yet, because those bags are so bodily and you want to touch, there's this question about what is that, like the mass, the weight of them. So
yeah, so I haven't ever weighed them. But I do know that each one of my bags of clay is 25 pounds. I would say that these rice bags each took roughly 18 to 25 pounds of clay. So it's funny. One of them definitely took the full 25, and I was like, oh, I'm sculpting a 25-pound bag of rice, and it took 25 pounds of clay. But then once it dries and all of the water content evaporates, it definitely becomes a lot lighter. But then, the rice bags aren't glazed, but then glaze adds a lot of weight back on. So I would guess it's probably 20 pounds, 15 to 20 pounds for the rice bags. I think the rice bags weigh what you would kind of expect them to weigh, whereas a lot of my smaller groceries, people often are like, oh, this is much lighter than I expected, because I think people assume that they're not hollow.
That question had also come up, and I was not 100% sure. And I was very happy that you talked about that early on. And now it's a great piece of information when we're talking to students.
It's really hard to when your work's not hollow, it makes it much harder to dry it out. And when it's not dried out, then it'll have problems in the kiln as the water vapor is trying to escape. People are always like, oh yeah, it doesn't explode. It doesn't typically explode unless you have a lot of water in there, but it will crack. And so it's much better to make hollow pieces. I think it would be more common to sculpt it solid and then try to scoop it out. But for many reasons, I prefer building with foil.
I have another personal question, but I want to hold back in case there's any students here, especially that have questions. I'm not seeing anybody, but and if you want to put a question in the chat, you can. I'll ask the question. I know from following you on Instagram that you've also made foodstuffs and grocery items associated with immigrant Jewish communities, especially in New York, and that you're kind of making connections between the Jewish diaspora and Asian American diaspora, specifically in New York. And I'm wondering if you could just tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I'm particularly interested in pushing back against the idea of authenticity. I think that in the past couple years, as the Asian, this current generation of Asian Americans who are, I don't know, in their 20s, early 30s, have become more politically active during the pandemic. I think that there are a lot of narratives about cultural ownership, like who is allowed to cook this food, what food is considered authentic, that I understand where the mindset comes from because you're trying to protect your heritage. But I also think that it's both ahistorical and a little nationalistic and dangerous. There's no such thing as a culture that isn't touched by other cultures, right? So that was the whole idea behind the show, where I made the Western foods that had a special place in Asian culture, because like the banh mi is like liver pate and mayonnaise on a baguette. It's like so French, but you would never try to cancel the banh mi and say, oh, this isn't authentically Vietnamese. And so to that point, I'm always interested in thinking about the point at which two cultures meet. And so this show at Harkerwick was in the Lower East Side, and the Lower East Side, it's, which is also where Chinatown is, or they abut each other, is where many Chinese immigrants still live. It's one of the few Chinatowns in America that is like actually populated by residents. But in the past, it was also highly populated by Jewish immigrants. And there are definitely points of connection and interchange and overlap between those two communities that I wanted to explore. So for this show, I made Jewish groceries and foods, and then also Chinese groceries and foods, and then items where the two intersected. I made like a mahjong set, right? Mahjong is obviously Chinese, but it is a part of Jewish American history. Jewish American families play mahjong, and even though the rules have changed, like it would be, I just think it's ahistorical to be like, no, it's Chinese only. And so another example of a food that I made was this sandwich that was very popular starting in the 50s in the Catskills. There was an area of the Catskills that was known as the Borscht Belt, because that's where Jewish families would go to vacation. And at that point, Jewish people had already started to eat a lot of Chinese food, even though it wasn't kosher, because of their proximity in the Lower East Side. They called it safe trafe. And they made this sandwich, which was Chinese barbecue pork with Chinese duck sauce and hot mustard on garlic bread. And this was a Jewish deli invention. And obviously the garlic bread, I think, is also an influence of the Lower East Side, because Little Italy is right there as well. And so I just love that, like, it's so authentically New York, and it only happened because literally those three types of people lived right there together.
New York, anybody that's passed through or lived there, it really, like, it's a little bit of that sort of insider thing when you and Melissa were talking about that sort of knowingness amongst, other Asian Americans, but there's that sort of New Yorky thing that happens as well. And there's actually a new cookbook out that I came across. I haven't seen it in person yet, called Kosher Soul by Michael Twitty. And it's about these intersections of Jewish and African American or Black American soul foods. So it seems like that's happening. There's people of different backgrounds kind of exploring those intersections.
Yeah, totally.
Well, I am happy to wrap it up and thank Melissa. Thank you, Stephanie, so much for a really engaging conversation. And of course, for sharing your time with us this evening. And thank you to our audience for joining us. The Syracuse University Art Museum's exhibition of Stephanie's work is up for the entire academic year through May. So we hope if you haven't seen it yet, you do come visit. We're in the Schaefer Art Building on the main campus, not far from the bus stop on College Place. Stephanie will also be collaborating with us on an in-person program here in Syracuse in the spring. So please stay tuned for details about that. And if you want to learn more about the SU Art Museum, you can visit our website. I'll put the link in chat if you don't know it yet, museum.syr.edu. And you can also find there information about other exhibitions, our permanent collection, other upcoming programs, including a talk and reception celebrating our Annie Albers exhibition this coming Monday, and an inaugural community day on October 2nd. Thank you all, and we hope to see you on Zoom or in person soon. Have a great evening, everyone.
Bye, everyone.